Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian. Hello, hello. Before I get into today's guest, can't wait for you to hear this interview, I wanted to talk about the big news over here at Dialogue. Hopefully you saw either on social media or in your actual podcast feed the bonus episode I dropped last Friday called Trialogue. That's right, Dialogue now has a companion podcast called Trialogue, a courtroom conversation. So just like Dialogue, it's going to be me interviewing people, but these conversations are going to center around law, trials, and cases going on in the news, some iconic past cases, but mostly we're really going to be focusing on things happening in real time. I am so excited about this. The idea really came on the heels of Derek Chauvin's trial because I got so obsessed with watching it on Court TV. I wanted to provide a way to recap what was going on every day, and I wanted to talk with you, my listeners, about it, but I quickly realized I'm a little bit out of my depth, and so I am better suited to do what I do well, which is ask questions of people who have the answers and then learn, right? So that's what I decided to do. So these episodes will be a lot like Dialogue. They're just going to be shorter and more concentrated on a very specific topic. Now, I dropped the first one in my main feed so as many people as possible could hear it. And the first episode of Trialogue was with my friend and past Dialogue guest, Kirk Nermey. You might remember him from episode 43. That was season 1 of Dialogue. If you haven't heard that, actually, you should go back. Kirk, of course, was the defense attorney for Jodi Arias. He is so much more than that. And you'll realize that when you listen to the conversation on Dialogue with him. But he was the perfect person to break down the Chauvin verdict with, not only because he's an experienced trial attorney, but he also knows what it's like and what Eric Nelson is experiencing, who of course is Derek Chauvin's attorney. And we talk a little bit about that, people's right to a fair trial, even when we don't like them or what happened. So we talk about that, and we also talk about his thoughts on a new kind of policing. So please tune in for that episode of Trialogue, which you'll find in your main Dialogue feed. And if you want more conversations like that around these cases, sign up for Patreon. So I've referenced that now. I have a Patreon. That's the big May news. I'm really excited. I've wanted to do this for a while. I feel ready to do it, but it's a little scary. And so it was a huge boost of confidence and so exciting on the first morning when I got my first 4 patrons. So thank you so much to these 4 Musketeers, my first 4 patrons, Jason U, Michelle K, Erin E, and Melissa C. Thank you so much. So in addition to Trialogue, what you're going to find on the Patreon is ad-free episodes of Dialogue, so you're always going to have those available to you. Additionally, many of you know I'm also a true crime trivia host. I am going to be doing some fun, short, 15-minute trivia interviews with your favorite podcasters and mine. You're going to find those on the Patreon. Discount on merch, on-air shoutouts, stickers, all the good stuff. Head on over there and know that we've just started putting things up there, so there's just going to be more and more, and I just can't wait. I can't wait to see how it grows and what happens, and I'm excited to produce new and additional content over there on Patreon. So I will have a link to the Patreon page in the show notes. I would be thrilled for you to take a look and check it out. Now, for today, we are talking to another true crime documentary maker, and this one, you guys, is really special. My guest today is Miles Hargrove. He is the director of a documentary called Miracle Fishing. Not only is he the director of this film, he was actually a subject in it. It's pretty wild. In 1994, Miles and his family were living in Cali, Colombia, and his dad was kidnapped by guerrillas.
As part of the business, they figured it out in such a way that they knew that what they had was safety so they could have time on their hands. And time is what makes people desperate.
Yeah.
And that was a weapon that they used against us all the time.
So he took his video camera and started filming everything that happened from the day he was kidnapped until the day he was returned. And yes, that is a spoiler in the plot point. Miles and I really get into the story and felt it was best to include that part, but you guys have to watch it. The suspense is like nothing I've seen in a really long time, and the film is so unique because it's entirely comprised of Miles's home video footage. 25 years later, he took this and assembled it and made this story. The documentary is available on Discovery Plus, and hey, if you need another reason to get Discovery Plus, if you've been like, I wonder if that streaming app is worth it, it really is. I got it, truth be told, because I'm in a couple couple episodes of Talking Evil, which is found exclusively on Discovery Plus. So of course I had to get it so I could watch these things, and I didn't cancel my subscription. I'm finding new things to watch there all the time, miracle fishing included. So please, this is not an ad. There's a lot of good stuff over there. So listen to my conversation with Miles and then go watch the doc. Or I won't be offended if you pause now, go watch the doc, and then listen to our conversation. Either way, I just loved hearing more of Miles' insight on the process, the journey, and really this is just an incredible story about a family and how they survived the unimaginable. Miles references FARC, F-A-R-C, a couple of times. And just to clarify, that is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. I just wanted to make sure that's super clear. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Miles Hargrove about his film, Miracle Fishing. Miles, thank you so much for being on Dialogue Podcast. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm thrilled. We're in a series on true crime documentaries, and I couldn't really be happier to include yours in this series because it's truly unlike anything I've watched or witnessed. I want to dive into the questions I have, I'm like burning up with, but maybe we could start with your family upbringing is unique. We learned that right away. So could you talk about how you grew up and your father's unique profession and how that took you to so many interesting places?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm a third generation expatriate. My mom was raised overseas by her parents. And my dad was from a West Texas farm, the same small town that my mom's family is from. She was traveling overseas and met my dad on her way from one country to another, visiting as a kid, and sort of planted this seed in his head about people that can actually live in these other countries and have these adventurous lives. And it really inspired him. And they were just friends, but after college and whatever, they got together and he married her. And that was his dream, was to just travel to as many exotic places as he possibly could. He was a soldier in Vietnam, and he got involved with introducing these new high-yielding rice seeds in the Mekong Delta to help eradicate the starvation, that kind of thing. And this was extremely beneficial to Vietnam at the time. And Dad got connected with a rice research institute in the Philippines. It's the world's leading rice development agency. And he got a job with them soon after. And we spent the first 19 years of my life in the Philippines, living on the side of a volcano, quite close to where they shot the movie Apocalypse Now. I had this kind of amazing upbringing. I've taken a lot of things for granted in my life, but having had that upbringing was special, and my parents reminded me of it then, and I always knew it. It was amazing. We got to travel, going back to the States every summer for home leave. We could go west and go to Europe or go to other places in Asia or whatever. And so we got to see a lot of the world that way.
So were you and your brother born in the States? Are you American citizens?
I was born in Abilene, Texas, very close to the same small town.
Okay.
But it was just while they were my parents were in transition. And 10 days later, I had a passport. And a month after I was born, I was on a plane to Iran, where my mom's parents were living at the time. And I spent my first Christmas there. And then a few weeks later, we moved to the Philippines.
Okay. So there was the Philippines, but your story, the story we watched, centers around your time in Cali, Colombia. So you moved there when you were older, or were you and your brother out of the house at that point?
I was still in my senior year of high school.
Okay.
So was my brother. It's a long story how that happened. But either way, my parents moved to Colombia in the middle of our senior year. And ordinarily, I think most seniors would be reluctant to have their family move at that time. But my parents had been in the Philippines for a long time. My dad was going to be looking for new work. And a lot of our friends had already gone off to college and stuff. And so we were excited about moving to a whole new continent. Like, we'd never been to South America. And so we spent that last semester in Cali kind of adapting, and had really probably the best 6-8 months of our lives. It was so carefree.
Yeah, that's one thing I made note of, that you and your brother, socially really liked it. You fit in, you enjoyed it. You thought it was fun, the lifestyle you took to it. How much of what was going on beyond your small social world, these bigger drug cartel conversations and the violence, that was obviously a real and present danger. How aware of it were you? And did it affect your day-to-day life?
Well, I mean, we knew about Colombia's reputation well before we moved there. And there were some concerns about that when my dad got the job. But we lived in the Philippines. There were 7 coup attempts in the time we lived there. We felt like we were savvy travelers, that we knew how to keep a low profile, not draw attention to ourselves, and to be kind of aware of the areas that you should or shouldn't go. So we felt like we could navigate Colombia easily. But, we were having a great time, but it was clear this wasn't just something that you could kind of keep away from in Cali at the time. I mean, it was literally the peak of the Cali cartel. Pablo Escobar was in prison in Medellin at the time. So Cali was really making its push, it already had attained the status of being the most powerful cartel in the world. And we would be driving down the street, and as friends warned us ahead of time, like if you see a Land Cruiser coming, particularly with motorcycles around it or anything coming at high speed, just move over, get out of the way. There were constant things like that. Like people would tell us, don't go to that club, don't go, that's where the mafia hang out. So it was all around us, but we were still able to navigate it fairly easily. It was concerning, but we were just teenagers having a great time. I mean, my mom was the one who she started having premonitions almost from the time we got there, that it was not a safe place to be.
Oh my gosh. And then unfortunately, your family finds out that's more than true. Your father, going to work like he does every day, takes one different route. He's running late. So there's kind of this moment where he can go the busy main roads, or he can go maybe a little off the beaten path. And that's what he decides to do, and ends up getting kidnapped. So this is the premise of the documentary. And I want to talk about how the year was 1990. Was it 4?
4, yes.
I have to say, in one of the very first scenes, your mom wants to get the dish or some setup so she can watch the cable because the OJ trial is going on. And I thought, what a great way to mark the place and time, because that is truly universal. Everybody on my podcast talks about they know where they were when that verdict was read. So that's such a marker, a sign of the times. So it's 1994. And you're already working with a camera. You have a lot of family footage prior to your dad's going missing and being kidnapped. So what was your affinity with the camera? Was that, all of your adolescence, or was it a recent hobby?
Well, I mean, from the late 80s into the early 90s, these smaller home video cameras were a new thing. And so my dad bought one for the family, and he used it to do touristy kind of things. And I just liked documenting silly things with the family. The way it sort of portrayed in the film, it seems as if I'm just documenting everything all the time. And to tell you the truth, the footage that is used to kind of set up the family's background is just about all the usable footage I have. It's really not that much. It just was, I was able to just get enough of those moments to have this, you only have a short time to develop a relationship with whatever character there is in a film. And so it kind of made sense to present me as the person behind the camera, so you kind of knew my place and why it made sense later on in the story. I never thought of myself as a filmmaker. I didn't even know you could have a career as a filmmaker. It was during the time of the kidnapping that the seed was sort of planted, that maybe I could do something with this footage. I didn't initially start out filming to make a documentary.
Right.
But when I revisited the footage from prior to the kidnapping, I do realize that there was a lot of, look, do a POV here. Let's get this angle there. So I was speaking the language without really knowing that that's what I would ultimately end up doing with my life.
Yeah, it seemed pretty innate. So can you talk about the moment where your family realizes what has happened, maybe set that scene a little bit for people who haven't watched yet, and then how this filmmaking ends up being part of the story, that you start documenting this in hopes to show your dad, right, what happened and what transpires during his absence. So just set the scene a little bit.
Well, my brother and I dropped out of college as soon as we found out the news, and we joined our mother. And we initially thought that because of the nature of my dad's humanitarian work, that maybe he would be let go out of the goodness of the gorillas' hearts. And we learned very quickly that was not the case. That in Colombia, kidnapping was such big business that it was evident that the only way you resolve a kidnapping is through the payment of ransom. very shortly afterwards, the company received a demand for $6 million. For the first 3 months of the kidnapping, we were working with the company, hoping the company would do the right thing. But clearly after 3 months, they weren't doing enough, in our opinion. And
this is your dad's employer,
this is my
the
dad's
company.
Yeah, exactly. And so just as we were getting to a point where we decided maybe we were going to have to take matters into our own hands, a package arrived from the guerrillas saying, we've tried dealing with the company. It's up to you. The demand is $6 million and you need to get a radio. Here's your code names. Here's our code names. And here's our primary frequency and our backup frequencies. And we'll speak next Tuesday. And so all of a sudden, this is kind of what we found ourselves in a position where we kind of got what we wished for, but then we had to figure out the logistics of making all that happen. And kidnapping was so prevalent at the time that we were able to find somebody who donated radios as a public service to other kidnapped families. This guy's family he'd had a kidnapping in his family, got a radio, and then he would donate these radios to other kidnapped families.
Unbelievable.
So we had this 30-foot antenna in our backyard and began negotiating.
And you assemble this village that becomes your absolute lifeline. And I think that's a really surprisingly, the whole thing is so hard to imagine living through. But I have to say, not that anybody would want to be in your situation, but it's quite beautiful the way family, friends, neighbors kind of come around and you become the task force, like everyday people. It's your friend from school who ends up being the translator on the radio communicating to the guerrillas. Can you talk about Robert? I found that just wild.
Well, Robert is I'm forever indebted to him. My whole family is. I met him my very first day of school in Colombia. He came up to me, introduced himself, and we became fast friends. He sort of showed me all the ropes of how to get around in Cali. And he was always over at our house. He loved my dad, and my dad loved him. And then, of course, the kidnapping happened, and he still was coming over trying to, help in any way he could. And he felt quite helpless. When it came time to begin these radio negotiations, we had to find somebody who was a local, who spoke the local dialect to speak for us. Ordinarily, it would be a company's lawyer or something like that. But we chose Robert. And he was maybe 22, 23 years old. Certainly there's been plenty of 23-year-olds that have done a lot of things in their lives, but he was still really a kid. In retrospect, I'm not sure that it was, a wise decision. But it end up being a wise decision. Robert was a natural at it, but we couldn't have known that right at the start, but he was amazing. They
say a good story has an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances. And to me, he's like the embodiment of that. All of you are, but particularly him, especially not being related, which is probably also a good move strategically, right? You don't want a family member doing that role. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Because a family member has so much at stake, what they could cave right there. Cause the threats were horrible. They were, that they were going to, sink the ship, and my dad was the ship, and, things like that.
Right. So let's talk about the negotiation and the business of the kidnapping a little bit, because I'm just very naive. I don't know anything about this. And, so this was, except what you see in movies. And of course, this did go on to become a dramatized film, Proof of Life. But the reality is you can't just give that first amount. That is not how it's done, right? Because that would be a bad move.
Well, and particularly in Colombia at the time. It was the world's kidnapping capital. The guerrilla group that got my dad was behind most of it. And they owned, or controlled, I should say, vast territories of Colombia where there was really no repercussions. They could take their prisoners, put them high up in the Andes or deep in the jungles, depending on where you were in the country. And, they could hold them at very little cost to them, security-wise or anything else. So I can't speak for other countries where maybe law enforcement has a lot more control, and the kidnappers would want to resolve a kidnapping much quicker. But as part of the business, they'd figured it out in such a way that they knew that what they had was safety, so they could have time on their hands. And time is what makes people desperate.
Yeah.
And that was a weapon that they used against us all the time. Like, great, well, let's speak next week. And ultimately threats of, we're not going to speak to you for a month. And, then carrying out those threats in real life, and then not speaking to us for 2 months, and it just crazy things like that, all as an effort to make us more desperate. So if we had the money and we gave them the $6 million, which we didn't have anything close to that, but if we had been able to do that right away, they would have said, that was too easy. Let's come back for more. They have to ultimately be convinced that they've taken you for everything you're worth. That's the game that you're playing.
Right. That is the game you're playing. And that's what really the majority of the film depicts, is this back and forth, this when do we concede, when do we hold on, this give and take. And it's excruciating to watch. It really, in the best way. I mean, the tension is so high. And I'm just thinking, just find the money, like give it to them, just say you have it. Like, and then, there is that point where your mom literally packs her bag and is just going to go get him. Like, she's just done with this whole thing. And I'm a mom and a wife. And I have to say that scene was so relatable. It's insane, but it's also so amazing. Can you remind me the timeline? Like, where are we in the journey when she just does that? She's like, I'm going. She packs a bag, leaves a note.
Yeah, so we were probably about 8.5 months into the kidnapping. And it was maybe a week or so after paying a ransom, hoping that he was going to come home. And it was like we were past the sort of deadline that we set in our minds as to when he should be home.
Right. So ultimately, you guys don't let her go. She sort of comes down from the place where she was. And I'm not trying to say she was in a delirious state, but I think she was just at the end of herself in that moment and felt the only thing left to do was to physically go herself. Whether she would end up being kidnapped or not, it's like no matter to her. Like, you guys were grown, you'd be okay.
Yeah, and she kept it together most of the time. That scene was always super important to me, that we built to it, and to really sort of be able to sympathize with what she was going through.
Because she had been so strong. And I have to wonder, I mean, talk to me about the day-to-day when you're going 7 days between phone calls, a month, 3 months. Ultimately, this ended up being 325 days. Was the mechanics of it and the business of it just the way you stayed distracted and focused and not dwelling on your dad's situation?
Well, I mean, we couldn't help but dwell on it every once in a while, but we soon found out that just wouldn't do you any good. We had no control over it. And the only thing we did have some sort of control over was the negotiations. So we had to put our focus in that. But the main way that we were able to overcome it, I mean, you mentioned this group earlier. We had neighbors that lived next door to us that almost from day one lived this kidnapping with us. And Claudia Greiner, she encouraged us to come together for these dinners and have music and put candles out and flowers and try experimenting with different dishes. And one night it'll be us, and another night it'll be Robert, and another night it'll be Greiner, getting these dinners together. And it was probably the most therapeutic thing we possibly could do, because it gave us, these were long, drawn out, depressing days. And so it just sort of gave us something to look forward to. For us to keep our humanity, kind of a stiff upper lip over, the whole world's beating us down, but we have to rise above, and thank God for that.
Absolutely. I watched that and felt a weird, strange sense of envy. If that makes any sense, you're living in the worst circumstances, but what you guys created as a way to survive was so beautiful, and something I don't think a lot of people have, because it takes intention and it takes prioritizing that making of a meal together, sitting down. I mean, it's something you take for granted when people have the freedom to do it with everybody they love around their table. Maybe they don't do it. And then in this situation, this is one of the ways you guys coped. And that kind of thing doesn't come around all the time.
Well, no, and it sort of explains the end of the film. It should be this, right off into the sunset, and there's a lot of apprehension about it as well. It's surprising, but it's this realization that this sort of team that we created, that we've come together for one purpose, was now finished with. There was so much love,
Yeah, now you have to disband, and the existence you've created together, you probably got into this rhythm, and then it's all going to fall away. It's complicated. Endings, whether they're happy or they're complex. So I want to talk about targeted individuals, and how much do you think they knew about your dad? Do these kidnappers go after people they're convinced to have the millions, or that they're hopeful? Are they guessing? Are they shooting blind? What do you think? And what did you learn?
Well, absolutely. They target individuals, high-profile individuals, political figures, sports figures, entertainment figures. At the time in Colombia, I mean, nobody was safe. If you were in the public eye, you certainly would be vulnerable. In my dad's case, though, the title of the film is Miracle Fishing, and that describes these operations that FARC and other Colombian guerrillas would do at the time. They call it pesca milagrosa, which is like miracle fishing. It's setting out a trap just on a roadblock in hopes of getting a fancy car or getting some cash. So it's really it varies. I mean, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but people were targeted all around.
And so can you talk about the role of the FBI agent that you had consulting and why his ability to intervene was so limited to just kind of a consulting role?
Yes, Oscar Tejeda was sort of the FBI officer attached to our case. I mean, well, technically the U.S. government doesn't negotiate with terrorists, so he couldn't facilitate anything like that because it's just something that the U.S. government doesn't do. And we understood that from the get-go. This wasn't the U.S. He didn't have any jurisdiction there. All he could do was help us as much as he possibly could. And initially, it started off as just sort of a procedural relationship or whatever. But over time, I think my mom would speak to him for long periods of time, and they developed a real bond. And this case became personal to him, like in a really big, big way. So, I mean, we understood it. We lived overseas long enough to know that, we're not in the control of the U.S. government when we're in places like that. And that's sort of one of the risks.
So what is the Colombian law enforcement role in kidnapping of one of their citizens or an expat? Is there one, or is the corruption does it run so deep that there's nothing that they do?
Well, so yeah, it's a mixture of both. I mean, they have dedicated police forces for kidnapping and that kind of thing, but the fear was the corruption. And so in our case, we gave them as much information as we needed to.
Okay.
Just really kept our situation on the down low, Because the thing about it is inevitably, since it's about money, you're going to have these points where vast amounts of cash are going to be having to be moved from one point to another in the city or out to the drop point wherever they want the money delivered to. And you're speaking on the radio. The more people that know about what you're up to, the more vulnerable you are.
Right.
So,
yeah, there's the inherent risk of the things you had to do, like these drops. Getting the money, moving them, hiding the money, moving the money. But then on top of that, if anybody additional knows, it could thwart the whole situation.
Absolutely. And I mean, even after we paid the ransom, we didn't know 100% whether, was it actually intercepted by somebody else? Did he actually, or is he dead? And they've just taken the money. There was all kinds of fears, that we just couldn't know.
Yeah. So talk about what you learned about proof of life, that you would at times require this because that's logical, and how difficult that was and how you had to ask for more in some cases when things weren't enough or clear.
Well, so as we entered this sort of dark, shadowy underworld of kidnapping, and ransom, that was the first word we learned, was proof of life. We never knew what it meant from the get-go, but we learned quickly it's so vital. But there's a lot of people that actually came out and claimed that they had my dad. They call the company and that kind of stuff. So until there's a proof of life, you're not dealing with the right people. You just don't know it. You can't prove it.
Yeah.
And we were taught that before any sort of major phase, like paying a ransom or anything else like that, you have to know that the hostage is still alive. You have to have a good proof of life. And we learned very quickly to save all of our newspapers, for instance. And we received one proof of life when we began our negotiations as a family. They sent us this photograph of him, and he's holding a newspaper. And within a matter of 3 or 4 minutes, we were able to determine, yes, he was alive 10 days ago, because we went to our pile of newspapers and we were like, that's the newspaper. He was alive 10 days ago. And that's a pretty good proof of life. It's kind of indisputable, particularly with the technology at the time. Later on in our ordeal, when things were getting really dicey near the end, there was this whole crackdown on the Cali cartel. So the country was in a bit of chaos, and that it didn't just affect us, it affected the guerrillas, because their movements were really restricted and they couldn't get in and out of their territory. They were surrounded by military. And so they weren't able to provide us what was considered a good proof of life. It was just a series of handwritten letters from my dad. He talks about things that, yes, were from him, but the date that he put on could have been written months ahead of time with a gun to his head. So it wasn't a satisfactory proof of life, and we had to make a big decision as to whether or not to pay that final ransom based on this really bad proof of life. Our advisors were telling us not to do it, but my mom had this instinctive sort of feeling that the guerrillas were indeed telling us the truth, that they couldn't get these messages through the lines. And so she just sort of made a leap of faith and decided to pay that second ransom based on this bad proof of life.
I mean, the stakes just couldn't be higher. I can't imagine making that decision. It's so terrifying. Now, would that time period that the guerrillas were talking about have been during, was one of the leader arrested? And is that why there was this attention on them?
Well, no, it wasn't the leader of the FARC, but it was multiple leaders of the Cali cartel. If you've ever seen Narcos, the original Narcos series, this is season 3 of Narcos, the crackdown of the Cali cartel.
Oh, wow.
It's literally happening in that last sort of summer during my dad's kidnapping. It just, over these weeks, this massive crackdown happened. And we were living in one of the nicer neighborhoods in Cali. And so inevitably, there are drug lords, there are people related to the industry that live around you. And there were helicopters landing in yards near us, military ones. They were making arrests almost every day. In fact, number 7 of the cartel was captured, and he was called El Alacran, which means the scorpion. And there was a list of his assets, and one of the properties was the rental, like this compound that we were living in. And so, I mean, it turned out to be nothing, but we were like, are we gonna, be kicked out of the house because this belongs to number 7 in the cartel?
At any point in this crazy education your family got on how these kidnappings work, did you learn the statistics of how often it ends with the death of the victim?
I can't speak for other countries, for what was going on in Colombia at the time. There's always a financial transaction. And the good news was that in Colombia, the chances were pretty high that if you just cooperated and you paid the ransom, that you would get the hostage back. And it was important to the FARC and the kidnappers that families knew that they cooperated, that things would work out for them. The only problem was when the military would attack these camps or apprehend or try and attack one of the camps where the victims were being held. We never wanted a rescue operation, and we had people from the U.S. government talking about, should we do one? And anytime anybody talked to us about it, we were just like, no, please.
Wow. That's got to be so hard to turn down, though, because as a viewer, you want someone to just drop in and pluck him up and bring him up on a rope into a helicopter. That is clearly not how it works. And you guys were right. But that's so hard to stay resolved in that decision and just see it through. I mean, even if you felt it was right, that had to have just been so difficult.
Well, it was. But, in the film, there's even a point where these missionaries who had been kidnapped for a number of months, we knew their families, they ended up dead for that very reason. Yeah. And so it was kind of proof to us that we were on the right, well, not that we were on the right path, but that wasn't the way we wanted to go.
This was the way to go. Yeah. And if money is the goal, then you have to just think like this is a business transaction. They would rather get the money than kill somebody for no reason and end up with nothing. Like you have to just keep that, I guess, paramount in your thinking.
Absolutely. That's what kept us kind of hopeful.
Okay. Your dad comes home miraculously and suddenly and kind of unexpectedly. And as a viewer, I didn't know if he was coming home. So all of a sudden it's get the camera. He's here. That's got to just be a ton of emotion in the house. Can you talk about that night?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were at our lowest low as a group because we had sort of been in chartered territory the whole time. And after we paid a second ransom and he didn't come home, and he was supposed to be released the day the ransom was handed over.
And so what time period is that? So the ransom was paid, he wasn't delivered, and then...
So, and he was supposed to be, it was supposed to be a simultaneous release. It didn't happen that way. They said, 3 more days in another town. We went to, our people went to this town. He didn't show up. So we're now at day 10, after the payment of the ransom. So my mom has taken this huge risk by accepting these bad proofs of life, and my dad hasn't come home. So there's a lot of guilt, and there's completely we're trying to, all along we sort of had a roadmap because of other kidnappings and stuff, but you're now kind of venturing into territory we didn't know.
Yeah.
And so we were all at a real low point. I would say the lowest of the whole kidnapping, maybe. And it was getting later, and it was time to get dinner together. My brother started up the grill outside, and I was in the kitchen with Robert, and I had the refrigerator open, and we heard this noise come out of the entryway, and it was like a male's voice, and I just put stuff down, and I ran out into the entryway, and in the darkness was my dad, and it was so crazy because it was like I screamed because it was scary, like it scared the hell out of me because it was like a ghost. It was him, but he looked so different. He had lost so much weight. He had this long hair and beard, and he had all this soot, embedded into his skin. He was wearing a poncho and rubber wellies, but I knew it was him, and he was alive. So there was this elation. Oh my God, what have they done to him? And then I embraced him, and as I was embracing him, he's like, "What are you doing here? I thought you were at school." And I was like, "Dad, we dropped out of school the day you were kidnapped." And then he asked where our mom was, and she was on the phone with his brother trying to figure out some plan for what to do next. And he was in West Texas. And next thing he hears is this screaming. The phone drops because my mom's seen my dad, and all my dad's brother can think is that my dad's body's been dumped at the house, or that these people have come in to get one of us to put more pressure on the family. And then he hears his brother pick up the phone. It was a really powerful moment. It was the most powerful moment of my life. There's like, nothing has ever, birth of my children was pretty powerful, but this was just in its own special way.
Yeah.
It was the most amazing moment of my life, but I hope I never have a situation that I have to have that kind of feeling again. Because
seriously,
and then you asked about the complication. There was shock. I mean, you could see it in the video. People put their hands up to their head apparently when they're in shock, because everybody was doing it. And then there's kind of like the realization of it all, and there's joy and there's elation. But that night there was the surprising sadness too. I think, like something we didn't speak of, but you could feel it. I remember going to bed that night and like crying, like out of happiness, but out of like just this feeling of this daunting task of tearing everything apart that we had sort of built up and having to start all over again.
Yeah, it's so much, and it's so palpable. That scene is incredibly powerful, and we won't go into too much detail about it because there's a lot to unfolds within it that's really special and beautiful and surprising about his time there and what he did simultaneous to what you were doing, and you both kind of discover that, and it's really cool. But when did your dad see all your footage? When did you bring him into that?
Well, I mean, my dad, for the first few days, certainly, and even the first few weeks, it was very hard to get him to focus on anything, which was understandable because he hadn't spoken to anybody in so long. And there was so much information for him to have to absorb and for us to absorb about what he had been through. It was a real challenge, because trying to explain to my dad some of the things that we had to do, taking matters into our own hands, as a family, like it took a number of days to sort of process what that really meant. And he knew his career was over, but I think he felt like maybe he had more time or something. It took probably a few weeks before I finally showed him a little bit. I mean, I would just play it off of the video camera. It's a video camera right there. Just play it back, things for him. And then 60 Minutes did a story about him. Gosh, it came out just a few months after he was released. And I got the opportunity to go to 60 Minutes and work, share some of my footage with them. So he saw some of that in this sort of pieced together way, but it wasn't what I wanted to make by any, but he saw the highlights. Yeah. That's for sure. And he was in awe. He was in absolute awe of, particularly, his wife did. I mean, but all of us, he was proud, and as we were of him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a moment where he says, I knew you'd do it, like, to you guys, like, it was amazing. And I honestly don't know that everybody in the world would be up for the job. And you were just this unique little group that banded together, and everybody leaned into their strengths and together you really did make it happen. And the fact that he kind of could see that, I can't imagine how overwhelming that was to him. Oh, man. So you guys have to leave. How quickly do you guys bolt out of Colombia?
Well, the flight out with my dad was, I think, 2 days after he was released. Everybody wanted him out of the country for security reasons. He was in the papers. It was a big deal in Colombia. So there was a lot of pressure. And so we were on a plane out. I went with him. We arrived in Houston and then flew to Dallas and took him to a mental health hospital to see how he was doing. And the doctors, when they got through with him, said that he was saner. The doctor said that my dad was saner than the doctor. So my dad was fine. He was back with his brother, and he wanted to go to West Texas and see his father, who was older and didn't have a long time to live.
I'm glad you brought up the hospital evaluation because I was certainly going to ask, was there any trauma person there to help your family deal with the aftermath? And I would think almost as much maybe for your mom as your dad. How did your mom fare after?
Well, my mom, I think everybody did pretty well on the whole, but there's no question that it had this huge effect on everybody for the rest of their lives. And particularly my parents. I mean, because my brother and I were able to go off to college and start off with we had all these adventures ahead of us. And my parents were kind of facing this sort of last phase before retirement. They weren't quite at retirement age, but my dad's career got cut short. And there was a lot of bitterness, I would say, from my mom about kind of what had happened. There was also a real dedication to kidnap. They moved to Galveston, Texas. Everything would be fine with normal dinner or whatever, and the phone would ring, and it would be the family of somebody who had just gotten taken, off of Nigeria, whatever. And my parents would drop into action mode, just walk them through detail. It was kind of this amazing transformation, just this being normal to going back to it. And they could never really escape that,
Yeah.
And my dad in particular, he had a real need to speak about it. There's plenty. I know a lot of kidnapping victims that don't want to ever speak about it. They still to this day, 20, 25, 30 years later, cannot speak about their kidnappings. My dad was not like that. He had a real need to talk about his experience, in fact, almost to the point where we sometimes just wanted to be just get through a hardware store or whatever and not get into this conversation, because if anybody heard it, they couldn't just be like, oh, you're kidnapped, and then just move on. It was always a thing.
Yeah. Well, he ended up publishing a book about it. I mean, he really wanted to put his story out there.
Well, he did. Those were his diaries that he managed to write, conceal, and escape, or not escape, come
Leave
home
with,
with
yeah.
without them knowing.
Brilliant.
I mean, he was able to turn those diaries into this book that's basically the diaries verbatim. It actually happened so quick after he was released that there was a real regret on his part. I think that he didn't sort of figure out how he wanted to write something a little bit more put together, because it's a lot of if you ever have the chance to read it, it's a lot of the same thing.
I think I will, because what your film does is capture the family's experience, but you get, tastes and glimpses of what your dad might be experiencing, and you're not even sure. And you do bring in the visual element of those letters. And I wondered if those were letters he was sending you, but I think it turns out those were things he was writing and that were on his persons while he was captured. Is that right? Or was it a combination?
No, that was all basically from his diaries, and that was part of the process of making the film, was figuring out how to present them. Originally, I was a lot more. You'd get full passages. You'd know that they were his diary. This was a diary entry from day 57 or whatever. Through notes and everything, it was working for us better to be more cryptic and have you kind of wonder, what are they? I think those are his diaries.
Yeah.
And then there's this sort of reveal at the end, because it's a shock to us all when he pulls off his money belt and throws all these diaries onto the table. The night he comes home, we just couldn't believe it.
It is. It's wild. It's so epic, and it is cryptic the way you include them throughout the film. But there's clues in them because the handwriting gets a little wobblier. You do see some changes in some of them. It's fascinating. So when do you decide that you're gonna use all this footage and make a film? And were you making films prior to this?
This footage made me want to become a filmmaker. So it's what before my dad was kidnapped, I thought I was going to go into music production or something. And then by the time the kidnapping was over, I knew I wanted to make this documentary. That was in 1995. And I was like, well, I'll give it a few years. I'll go to college. I'll get some money together and, make it happen. And then, I did just that. In 2001, I got my first editing system with the hopes of I'm going to get this done in like a year or two, and then just learned the hard way that that's not often the way it works. And I would get people that were interested in helping me, but or that wanted to take the story over altogether, but they wanted to do recreations and they wanted to do this and they wanted to do that. It was so important to me that this was my first real film, my film. It's all mine. And any director has to have their first film. And why can't this be mine? This is mine. I can give you a more authentic, version of what happened than anybody can because I lived it. If I can if it rings true to me, then you can't really question that. I mean, you can have your opinion about it, but that it's authentic, and that's what I wanted it to be the whole time. And in order to get your way, sometimes things take a much longer time.
Absolutely. And you have to do them yourself. If you had a vision for this and people weren't getting it or they wanted to do recreations, I loved that you actually heard voiceovers from people currently but didn't see them, and you really stayed in the present experience. I loved that. So I appreciate how you made that. This is something that struck me. What is more surreal, living the lived experience of what you went through or watching it retrospectively 2 decades later?
Well, I mean, obviously living it had to been the most surreal thing. It certainly was. There's just no way it couldn't be. But I guess the footage was close to me for a long time afterwards. I never was away from it for a long enough period in the earlier years that it's, and the kidnapping was so close in those first few years. I didn't see the footage as being so surreal. It was when I took after an 8-year hiatus, my parents passed in quick succession, and it was a real shock, and it was hard, and I put the film away, and I think it was, and started my own family and worked on other people's films and got the experience I needed to. When I came back to it, I wasn't going to stop because it had been so start for a number of years already. And so when I came back to it after an 8-year hiatus in 2017, that was super surreal. My mom had been gone for a while at that point. It was hard, but then you, as with all things, as we did say with the kidnapping, you get used to it and you get numb to it. Just recently, it got released on Discovery Plus, and that's it's like the surreal part all over again, because now it's not just this home video that I've just been living with personally, for so long. It's out there in the world, and people are getting their own thing, each different person from it, and this is completely surreal now to have it finished, and out there the way I wanted it to be.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I was so sorry to learn that your parents passed. I'm so sorry to hear that. They were just incredible people that I feel like I know now. Do you feel like the time was right for it? It feels like a really interesting time in the documentary landscape for this story to come out. To me, I would think it's a great time when people are very kind of hungry for this kind of content. Has that been your experience?
Well, that remains to be seen. What's interesting to me is that I thought it was going to be done so many years earlier. The kidnapping was still like a major thing in Colombia. And then the problem is, it's not that it's gone entirely, but it's just a shadow of what it used to be. And so in Colombia. And so there was this feeling of like, maybe the relevance of the story is gone. And when I wanted to do the film originally, it was still the world was still standard definition, so the footage still had this more contemporary feel about it. And then there was this like, oh wow, I mean, the world's moved on to high definition, and I've got this terrible looking old standard definition footage. So I never thought that it was going to be a time capsule, but it became one because 25 years later, I think that's the time it takes for us to really look at another era in a really different light. I think you need a good 20, 25 years to be able to do that. And so that's why like that line of setting up the O.J. Simpson was so important to me. It's like just instantly get you right where you are, right where to that time. But I love it. There's tapered jeans and the shirts are too big, and
the printout from it's like 3 miles long.
All that stuff. And So that's something that this whole unexpected thing that was never the plan, was to have this sort of secondary sort of time capsule element to it. And so that part is really good. I just feel like a story about normal people overcoming these unbelievable events. I think those kinds of stories are timeless. So that part never worried me. But then when this film was supposed to be released, its premiere was supposed to be at Tribeca last year, got canceled with the pandemic. It's sort of ridden the whole wave of the pandemic. It was sort of the worst time. I mean, it's been a bad time for everybody. But if you're trying to release a film after 25 years, 2020 couldn't have been a worse year, and excruciating, because I still have not yet sat with an audience.
Right.
To watch this film. And every filmmaker, I mean, maybe it's an ego thing, I don't know, but you just want to sit there and I kept it to myself for so long. I just still need to have that experience, and that'll be really surreal, speaking to.
Oh, I can't wait for that to happen. And it'll probably be all the more a full experience and a range of emotions, because nobody's had it in so long, like a movie theater experience. So I'm sure that will be well worth the wait. I can't wait for that for you as well. One thing I ask all my guests in closing is what gets you up in the morning? Literal, figurative, both?
Well, I mean, 9 times out of 10, it seems, are my kids for school. And, but right now, what's getting me up in the morning is I've been living with this for so long that have affected the course of my life because of this film. And now it's finally out and I'm free. And I think that's the most amazing thing. I'm not quite sure what it is I'm going to do. I do want to keep working on films, but I love the fact that I don't have this weight on my shoulders anymore. So that's what gets me up in the morning. That's awesome. Yeah, you made the thing and it's released now, and it's always going to be part of your story, but the work of it is over. Yeah. It's liberating. It really is. Good. Glad to hear that. Well, thank you so much for killing the small talk with me on Dialogue. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I'm just grateful to you for having me. Absolutely. Dialogue is a Yellowtape Media production, edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.